All right, let's get started again. Boy, oh boy. Session 5B, The Coming Kingdom, Part 4. This stuff really is interesting, isn't it? Plus, the historical prophecy fulfillments are great proof for the existence of our omniscient, eternal God who knows all things. Now we're ready to address a very pivotal prophecy, the interpretation which affects all eschatological timelines. Try to say that real quick. The fourth vision of Daniel is the famous 70 weeks prophecy. Biblical chronologers have wrestled with this passage for centuries, I believe to no avail. Many theories have been proposed and abandoned when their prophecy or projected dates failed to fulfill expectations. The most common of these interpretations is that the 70 weeks or 70 sevens are quote-unquote weeks of years or sabbatical years, which makes the span of 70 weeks, 70 sevens, to be 490 years. So people are trying to use this to span the gap between Daniel and the New Testament. Okay? But most chronologers take the starting point of this count from the 20th year of Artaxerxes I, when they say Nehemiah was given the governorship of Judea with a command to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. However, I disagree with that because neither Xerxes nor Artaxerxes could have been Esther's husband. Both of those were way too late. Darius and Xerxes and Artaxerxes, as I explained, are throne names. You can see what they mean in Bullinger's Appendix. But Bullinger had a different idea of who it was, and his solution is too early. We saw earlier that Darius I had to be Esther's husband because of the age of Mordecai. In the handout I'm going to give you on those Esther, Nehemiah, and Ezra, Mordecai was in the first carrying away, and we know when that was, within 6 months. All right? And so then we know what the years' reigns were for Nebuchadnezzar and all his successors, and Cyrus and Cambyses and Darius. And so for Mordecai to be the Grand Vizier after the 12th year of the king, it had to be Darius I, because he would have been in his late 80s or early 90s. That's still plausible. But being over 120 during Artaxerxes' time is not plausible. Okay? So it has to be Darius I. That moves the timeline for the Jewish influence in the Persian Empire earlier and affects any starting point for this 490-year option if it's true. Daniel chapter 9's prophecy, the second temple construction was restarted in the month of Elul in 519 BC and finished in Adar of 1515 BC. That's during Darius I's reign. Ezra arrived in Jerusalem soon afterward. Mordecai's appointment as Grand Vizier and the Feast of Purim occurred in the winter of 509 BC. So, because of Queen Esther and the Grand Vizier Mordecai, the Jewish influence in the Persian court persisted till the 20th year at least of Darius I, when it involved the appointment of Nehemiah, a known Jew. He at that time was the chief of security. He bore the cup before the king. He was the official food taster. Okay? So he was chief of security. And he then became the governor of Judea. Nehemiah is also mentioned in the 32nd year of the king. So the Jews enjoyed great influence in Darius I's reign. I believe that in 501 BC, which was the 20th year of Darius I, was when the wall in Jerusalem was built. Tishri I fell on September the 19th in 522 BC, during a time when the Hebrew lunar calendar and months were synchronous with Babylon and Persia. Darius the First assassinated the impostor that was contending for the throne after Cambyses died. This other impostor was named Smerdis or Gaumata, and he assassinated him on September the 29th and became king shortly thereafter. Therefore, his accession year was from Tishri the 1st, 522, to Tishri the 1st, 521. So Nisan in his 20th year would have been in 501 BC. If the starting point for the 490 years was the king's decree or appointment of Nehemiah for that task, beginning in 501, the 490 years would end in 11 BC. Well, that's not significant of anything. All right? Nehemiah's king can't be Xerxes, because Nehemiah mentioned him reigning in his 32nd year, and Xerxes' reign was only 20 years. So the only other possibilities are Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes the first 20th year results in a 44 AD end. That doesn't work either. If we try to do it from Cyrus's command in 539, 490 years, the math doesn't work either. So what I say is, yes, there were 497s, but the sevens were weeks, physical 7-day weeks, and not years. Very interesting. Daniel chapter 9 verse 20 is where we begin. While I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, he was making intercession for them. Now, of course, without speaking in tongues at that time, but it still was effective. And presenting my supplications before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God. You know what? That kind of intercessory prayer is something we need to do for our nation. We definitely do. Moses and Aaron did it. Samuel did it. Okay? Yea, while I prayed, I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I'd seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation. And he informed me and talked with me and said, "O Daniel, I am now come forth to give you skill and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications the commandment came forth, and I am come to show you, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore understand the matter and consider the vision. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy." Boy, there's a lot of tantalizing phrases there, aren't there? "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks, 62 weeks. And the street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off." Cut off is the term for killed. "But not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the then thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined." Wow. Bunch of pregnant phrases there. You know, very, very full of symbolism and import. "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week shall he cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations," there's the abomination of desolation, "shall he make it desolate even until the consummation, and that be determined shall be poured out upon the desolate." Wow. Counting 490 years, from the 20th year, Darius I, which is 501 BC, yields no significant date. Counting 490 years from the 20th year of Artaxerxes I doesn't yield anything either. But Herod Anderson, in his book titled The Coming Prince, proposed using so-called prophetic years, which were 360 days long. Okay? Not lunar years. All right? But Edwin R. Thiele, when he did his chronological work in the mysterious numbers of the Hebrew Kings, he disproved that concept because no Jew ever used it. The only 360-day years in the Bible were before the flood. It simply was a fudge factor that I believe Anderson used to try to reach an incorrect target, which he believed when Christ's ministry was, from an incorrect starting point. He was aiming from when he thought Artaxerxes I gave the command, and he was shooting for 31 through 33 AD, which he thought was Jesus' ministry. But we know when Jesus' ministry was, because it had to be a year when the 14th of Nisan fell on a Wednesday. And Parker and Duberstein have done work, and we know what year that was. It was 28 AD. So, wow. The key to understanding this prophecy is to realize that it is an introversion. It goes A, B, C, C, B, A. Okay? Goes in, comes back out. At this point, I'm going to defer to a handout I'm going to give you from the appendix of my 4th book on Jesus' sermons, The Path into Eternity. This is based also on work done by the Reverend John Crouch and Walter Cummins that they did in their unpublished work, Jesus Christ Our Apostle and High Priest. Walter later published a book on the acceptable year of the Lord with the same content. It also was presented in the Sound Out teaching in Tennessee, which I believe was in 1984. Daniel 9:24 contains 6 items which form a symmetrical ABC CBA structure. And they showed that the opposite categories, the A corresponding to the A and the B corresponding to the B, can be used to explain their counterparts. So they are 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, upon thy holy city. Number 1, A, to finish the transgression. B, to make a seal, an end of sins. C, to make reconciliation for iniquity. Then the corresponding C, to bring in everlasting righteousness. The corresponding B, to seal up the vision and prophecy. And the corresponding A, to anoint the most holy. There are 6 infinitive phrases there, which are separated by ands. So, it's a polysyndeton, right? Many ends. And there are other kinds of lists, like an asyndeton, with no ends. And that's meant to be run through quickly. But this is meant to be a momentous summary of things, and you have to munch on every one. All right? We're actually being treated to a pinnacle of understanding of the great prophet Daniel that was given to him by Gabriel. Obviously, since this is expressed in ethereal, what I call prophecy speak terms, the phrases could refer to several kinds of things. But the numbers are the most straightforward that are given in this passage. And so if we can find out how the numbers fit, that'll aid us in deciphering the rest of the phrases, the A, B, C, C, B, A. And we can fit them because the A's correspond with the A's and the B's with B's and the C's with C's. So, A is to finish the transgression and to anoint the most holy. B, to make And that word is seal, an end of sins, and the other be, and to seal up the vision of prophecy. You see the repetition of the word seal? That is a clue that God is giving to us that this is an introversion. Okay? And then the middle C's, to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness, correspond. So what does it mean to finish the transgression? The answer is to anoint the most holy. When was the most holy, the Messiah, anointed? When he received the Spirit, when he was baptized. That phenomenal voice from heaven indicated that this was an administration change. My work on administrations. Every administration begins with phenomenal, audible words from heaven that anyone could hear, with or without Spirit. They were in the census realm. So the transgression, quote unquote, that was finished, this is God's terminology, had to be the end of the law administration. Therefore, the baptism of Christ on Sunday, Shabbat the 20th, which was February 16th in 27 AD, was the beginning point of the 70 literal weeks. The B terms involved Christ's death and resurrection. God inserted that signal to make sure we saw it with the reposition of the word seal. When Christ was raised from among the dead, that was the consummation of the ages. It sealed it, as Hebrews 9 affirms. Hebrews 9:26, for then must he, Jesus, often have suffered since the foundation of the world, but now once, in the consummation of the world, ages, hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Once Jesus had arisen from among the dead on May the 1st in 28 AD, everything was sealed. The prophecies were fulfilled in all forthcoming spiritual events, like the gathering together, the resurrections, the judgments, the kingdom of heaven, and the new heaven and earth. The rest of eternity were a foregone conclusion. So finally, the C terms, taken together, must be the day of Pentecost, June the 20th, 28 AD, when reconciliation became possible and everlasting righteousness for believers commenced. That constituted the end of the 70 weeks. 490 days is the length of Jesus' earthly ministry. And it fits. Daniel chapter 9, verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment, that's the decree, to restore and to build Jerusalem, unto Messiah the Prince, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. This is a prophecy, verse 25, in true ethereal form, spoken from God's perspective, not man's. The street and the wall is like the expression, it's a figure of speech, like Alpha and Omega. Okay? Or we would say from soup to nuts, from A to Z. That is the entire thing. The two extremities represent the whole thing. Okay? So, that would be the whole thing. All was rebuilt spiritually. And that's what Jesus did when he came. He rebuilt everything, didn't he? Okay? So that's the street and the wall, the whole thing. Now, this is not to say that this prophecy might have a dual fulfillment. There are prophecies like that. For example, we saw one earlier with the abomination of desolation, also another one in Isaiah 7:14. A virgin or young woman shall conceive a son and shall call his name Emmanuel. That happened twice. The difference in the case of multiple fulfillments are nuances in the meanings of the key words. In this case, virgin can have two different meanings. And one fulfillment is one meaning, and another fulfillment is the other. Very interesting. It can mean a young woman as well as a modern meaning. Another example of how prophecies can intermix is Revelation 12. If you read Revelation 12, it's markedly timeless, where different events from both past, and future are juxtaposed in a different kind of sequence other than lineal time. Whew. So it's a different perspective from God's perspective. And so sometimes prophecy speak is like this. It intermixes things, multiple fulfillments. In this context of the weeks being enumerated, what was the decree to restore and build Jerusalem? Well, it would have been the voice from heaven when Jesus was baptized. That commenced his work. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. That's what the people heard. But to Jesus, that was the go sign. You got it, son. Everything's all yours. It's up to you. It was called a decree. He had all the heavenly endorsement that he needed to commence his Father's work. Only he knew what that all was. But now, with our new understanding of these phrases, and I've done a study in my 4th volume, The Path into Eternity, on the oracles of God. These were royal decrees convincing both the time periods of administrations and the phases of Christ's ministry. There were 7 phases in Jesus' ministry. And we can understand some of the deeper ramifications of this when we see that they were decrees, the logios, the oracles of God. So, this was exactly what Jesus' job was, to restore and build Jerusalem. The Judeans were looking forward to a political deliverer who would restore Jerusalem to its original rightful place in the world. That's where it's going to be in the future. Even greater than it was in the time of David and Solomon. But Jesus first came to do it spiritually. He'll be coming back to finish the job physically in the second fulfillment. Wow. Daniel 9 speaks of 2 time periods, 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Were those successive or concurrent? It could be taken 2 ways. If we try to match them to events in that year, in 28 AD, Holy Week did indeed start after 62 weeks from the baptism. If we count beginning with Jesus' baptism and end on the day of that voice from heaven on Nisan the 10th, when the Passover lamb was selected and the voice from heaven came, I will glorify it and will glorify it again. And people heard it. They said an angel talked to him. That ended the 62 weeks and started Holy Week. That was 1 week. And then in the midst of the week, Jesus died. So Daniel 9:27 fits. It makes it fit. If we count the 7 weeks concurrently from the baptism, it brings us to the 10th of Nisan in 27 AD when Jesus first went to Jerusalem, that Passover week. And that is when, on that day, he first cleansed the temple. So remarkably, we can see that Jesus cleansed the temple on Nisan the 10th twice, once in 27 AD and once in 28 AD. Fascinating. So it could be that way. Also, it might be possible to put the 7-week period at the end, and that would correspond to the 7 weeks between the resurrection and Pentecost. The end of that counting was Messiah the Prince, which would be on Pentecost, when he officially took the reins of the church. To me, that would be the more logical understanding of the 70 weeks. 62 plus 1 plus 7 equals 70. Okay? And sometimes in the Bible, when they do counting, they do 4 or 3. Okay? It shows up in Proverbs. So this kind of, what we would think would be backwards counting, because we would say 3 or 4. We wouldn't say 4 or 3 unless we're that comedian from Louisiana. All right? I forget what his name was. He commented that when you fly from Louisiana to Texas, you land before you start because of the time change. But anyway, that was funny. But so it could be possible that The 70 weeks is 62 plus 1 plus 7. All right. Daniel 9:26 now moves it on to further details. This is where it begins to be apparent that there must be an expansion of time, another fulfillment with verse 26. Verses 26 and 27 are not necessarily chronological. The prophecy expands upon the destruction of Jerusalem before returning to the actual order of events. Verse 26. After 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. He died, but not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come. So this is a different prince than Jesus, who is a prince. Shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, Jesus is not going to do that. And the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. There's going to be a war. Verse 26 foretells that the Messiah will be cut off after the 62 weeks. Well, Jesus died after the 62nd week, in the middle of the next week, on Wednesday. Then it says, the people of a coming prince shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, the temple. That did happen in 70 AD, and so therefore the prince would have been Titus, who later became emperor of Rome. His people were his legions. The end did come with a flood. The Hebrew word shapteh. That can mean a literal flood, but also it's used of an invading army. You can look it up in Brown Driver Briggs. After the siege of Jerusalem, when it broke, the Roman legions rushed in, they destroyed the temple, and an abomination of desolation did occur. The altar and the temple were desecrated, according to Josephus. In Matthew 24, Jesus predicted that not one stone would be left upon another. So thorough was the destruction by the Romans. That's why the Wailing Wall can't be the temple. It actually is the fortress of Antonia. Dr. Ernest Martin shows that the actual location of the temple is about 1,000 yards to the south. And it's area that they could begin building tomorrow if they wanted to. Wow. So the Romans were so enraged with the Jews because of their stubbornness that they stormed the city, they murdered thousands, they burnt down the temple, and they pried apart the foundation stones to recover any melted gold from the burnt treasury that had been kept in the temple. So far this prophecy remarkably still tracks with the facts of history. If we take the 490 to be 490 days, or instead of years. He, in 9:27a, first part of the 9, verse 27, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week she shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Well, the 1 week was Holy Week, April 25th to May 1st in 28 AD. That is when the covenant was confirmed. The many, what covenant was that? We're going to see it's the covenant of Jeremiah 31. The many is all of us who have been blessed thereby. Jesus was tortured, crucified, and died and arose that week. And it was a literal week ending just before Saturday evening when the next week began. In the middle of the week on a Wednesday, Jesus died. At the same time, the Passover lamb was killed and was the supreme sacrifice for sin, as the book of Hebrew explains. And the daily sacrifices and the people's offerings were no longer necessary. He caused the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Wow. It's remarkable that how this research brings all these things together to make ancient prophecy fit. Second half of verse 27. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. When's that? Ain't happened yet. And that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. The second temple has never been rebuilt. Daniel predicted that this desolation will last even until the time of consummation. That is when the temple is supposed to exist again in the future. It shall then be the same temple that the Antichrist shall occupy, as 2 Thessalonians 2:4 says. So again, Daniel fits. There was an abomination of desolation in 70 AD, and there will be another in the future. The one in 70 AD did occur when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. So Jesus' prophecy in the Olivet Discourse involved a fulfillment of Daniel 9, which indeed happened within a generation, like he said. The Romans did desecrate the city, the Holy of Holies, on that day. The temple was destroyed when the legionnaires sacrificed to their standards in the Holy of Holies, according to Josephus. I'll include since we're going long in the segment, I'm going to include an excerpt from Josephus that talks about this. I may read some of it because it's just amazing to see. Caligula, one of the Roman emperors before, had tried to get his statue set up in the Holy of Holies and failed. He had sent Petronius to accomplish that task, and Josephus records that the Jews pleaded earnestly that he don't do it. The fact that they were so willing to die to prevent this gave him pause, and Caligula was so enraged that he commanded that Petronius be killed. But Caligula himself died before that could be carried out. So the criteria indeed was met for the pollution of the site to warrant that term abomination that Jesus had predicted, and with a flood, with a military charge that Josephus records. I'll read some of this from Josephus. This is from his war book, Book 6, Chapter 6. The rebels, shortly after they attacked the Romans again, and with a clash that followed between the guards of the sanctuary and the troops who were trying to put out the fire inside the inner court, the latter routed the Jews and followed in hot pursuit right up to the temple itself. Then one of the soldiers, without waiting any orders and with no dread of no momentous a deed, but urged on by some supernatural force, snatched a blazing piece of wood, and climbing on another soldier's back, hurled the flaming brand through a low window in the temple that gave access on the north side to the rooms that surrounded the sanctuary. So the inside of the temple was set afire. As the flames shot up, the Jews let out a shout of dismay that matched the tragedy. They flocked to the rescue with no thought of sparing lives or husbanding their strength, for the sacred structure that they had constantly guarded with such devotion was vanishing before their very eyes. No exhortation or threat could now restrain the impetuosity of the legions, for passion was in supreme command. Boy, Josephus was great with words, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Crowded together around the entrances, many were trampled down by their companions. Others, stumbling on the smoldering and smoke-smelled ruins of the porticos, died as miserably as the defeated. And they drew closer to the temple. They pretended not even to hear Caesar's orders, because Tiberius had said, "Don't burn it down," but urged the men in front to throw in more firebrands. The rebels were powerless to help. Carnage and flight spread throughout. Most of the slain were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, and they were butchered where they were caught. The heap of corpses mounted higher and higher about the altar. A stream of blood flowed down the temple steps, and the bodies of those slain at the top slipped to the bottom. When Caesar failed to restrain the fury of his frenzied soldiers and the fire could not be checked, he entered the building with his generals, looked at the holy place of the sanctuary and all of its furnishings, which exceeded by far the accounts, current and foreign lands, and fully justified with their splendid repute. As the flames had not yet penetrated to the inner sanctum, but were consuming the chambers that surrounded the sanctuary, Titus assumed correctly that there was still time to save the structure, and he ran out, and by personal appeals, he endeavored to persuade his men to put out the fire, instructing Liberalius, a centurion of his bodyguard of spearmen, to club any of the men who disobeyed his orders. But their respect for Caesar and their fear of the centurion's staff, who was trying to check them, were overpowered by their rage, their destruction of the Jews, and an utterly uncontrollable lust for battle. Most of them were spurred on, moreover, by the expectation of loot, convinced that the inner structure was full of money, and dazzled by observing that everything around them seemed to be made of gold. But they were forestalled by one of those who had entered into the building, and who, when Caesar dashed out to restrain the troops, pushed a firebrand in the darkness onto the hinges of the gate. Then, when the flames suddenly shot up from the interior, Caesar and his generals withdrew, and there was no one left to prevent those outside from kindling the blaze. Thus, in defiance of Caesar's wishes, the temple was set on fire. When the temple was ablaze, the attackers plundered it, and countless people who were caught by them were slaughtered. There was no pity for age, no regard was accorded rank. Children and old men, laymen and priests likewise were butchered. Every class was pursued and crushed in the grip of war, whether they cried out for mercy or offered resistance. Through the roar of the flames streaming far and wide, the groaning of the falling victims were heard, such as was the height of the hill and the magnitude of the blazing pile, that the entire city seemed to be ablaze, and the noise, nothing more deafening and frightening, could be imagined. There were the war cries of the Roman legions as they swept onwards in mass, the yells of the rebels encircled by fire and sword, the panic of the people who, cut off above, fled into the arms of the army and the enemy, and their shrieks as they met their fate. Their cries on the hill blended with those of the multitudes in the city below, and now many people who were exhausted and tongue-tied as a result of hunger, when they beheld the temple on fire, found strength once more to lament and wail. Perea and the sounding hills added their echoes to the deafening din, but more horrifying than the din were the sufferings. The Temple Mount, everywhere enveloped in flames, seemed to be boiling over from its base, yet the blood seemed to be more abundant than the flames, and the numbers of the slain greater than those of the slayers. The soldiers climbed over heaps of bodies as they chased the fugitives. Wow, that's Josephus, when the temple was destroyed. And later on, he documents that they sacrificed to their standards in the Holy of Holies after the fire was out. So, wow. There's a bunch more prophecies in Daniel. Let's see here. I do need to cover a little bit about Jesus in the Olivet Discourse. So let's go to Matthew chapter 24, verse 1, because there's some questions that I need to answer. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to him, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Well, the Wailing Wall is one stone upon another. Okay? Wow. That occurred in 70 AD. Verse 3, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, his disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? It doesn't say world. It says Ion, age. That's very important. Verse 3 actually is a separate event later on that same day from verses 1 and 2. His disciples asked him 3 questions. Jesus only answered 2. Verse 4. Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I'm Christ, and shall deceive many. And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All of these are the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. It's all future stuff. Then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall arise, and deceive many. And because of iniquity shall abound, the love of many, their commitment, shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness to all nations. Then shall the end come. So you see how many elements of that are future? See, the first portion answers their last question. When shall the end of the age come? But we must correct that translation because it's not the world, it's the age, right? But the key question is what age or time period is he talking about? See, one of the greatest errors of those who are deeply involved in end times research and the book of Revelation and studying prophecy is they don't understand the great mystery that was still secret at that time. All components of the great secret that are listed in 1 Timothy 3:16 were not divulged till later. So here, in Matthew 24, Jesus is speaking without referring to elements of the great mystery. There are a few indicators of this in what Jesus said. In verse 13, he declared, but he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. Well, that is not grace administration doctrine, is it? How do we get saved? Romans 10:9, right? That's a sixth administration doctrine. Then in the next verse, Jesus mentioned the gospel of the kingdom shall be mentioned, taught worldwide. Well, what is that? Is that a sixth administration doctrine? It may be. One must keep things within the administrations to which they belong. But there's an exception to this rule that I found. There are some events foretold that are physical or secular things outside the context of the mystery. For example, Daniel foretold that the next empire after Alexander the Great and his generals would be the Roman Empire, the one made of iron. This is the empire that the stone made without hands would strike. And he said that it would be split in two, one part iron and the other clay. The Roman Empire did split in two, but it was after the gospel period during the grace administration. That was a secular event not having to do with the doctrine of the mystery. I think that it still is true. The second example is the temple was destroyed in a flood, a military charge, in 70 AD, and not one stone was upon another, and the abomination of desolation occurred. Jesus foretold that the temple would be destroyed, and not one stone would be upon the other. That did occur in 70 AD during the grace administration. So I think that great mystery only involves keeping doctrinal matters that applied secret. Right? There still can be events that were prophesied in the Old Testament that are secular in nature that could occur during our administration. The historical record is a little puzzling. We know from Josephus and the Roman historians that Judaism was virtually crushed and the Roman Empire after that onslaught in Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of Jews had come for the Passover earlier that spring, and they'd been trapped in Jerusalem by the siege. Okay? Most of them were killed or enslaved along with the inhabitants of the city. But what happened to the Christians that were there in Jerusalem and Judea? I think they believed the warnings which Jesus had given about when you see the abomination of desolation, when you see armies encircling, beat it out of town. There is record from Eusebius, a church historian, concerning this. The whole body, he says, of the church of Jerusalem, having been commanded by a divine revelation given to men of approved piety there before the war, removed from the city and dwelt at a certain town beyond the Jordan called Pella. This is corroborated by another historian, Epiphanes. It is very remarkable that not a Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem, though there were many there when Cestus Gallius, the first general, as he had persevered in the siege, he soon would have rendered himself master of it. But when he unexpectedly and unaccountably raised the siege, the Christians took that opportunity to escape. Then he goes on to say in another quote, as Vespasian, his replacement, was approaching with his army, all who believed in Christ left Jerusalem and fled to Pella and other places beyond the river Jordan, so they all marvelously escaped the general shipwreck of their country. Not one of them perished. Well, what prophet was that told them to leave? Jesus told them to leave when they saw those signals. So that's really interesting. Next prophecy of Daniel is Daniel 10, verse 14. This one begins, now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days. Well, who is thy people? Israel, not us. So that's Daniel chapter 10. The next vision, the sixth vision, is in Daniel 11. This is a fascinating forecast of a rivalry between the king of the south and the king of the north. That would be between the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt and the Seleucid dynasty in Damascus. We don't have time to cover the whole thing, but verse 1 through 5, Daniel 11, also I in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now I will show thee truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. Okay. The fourth one, Cyrus is the first, Cambyses the second, Darius the third, Xerxes is the fourth, and Xerxes did attack Greece. Okay. That's the incident with Thermopylae and the 300 and all of that. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, not Alexander the Great's kids, nor according to his dominion where he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside those. So it was divided between his generals. Verse 20, then shall stand up in his, now it goes through a whole list of stuff going on between the king of the north and the king of the south. And then shall stand up in his, Antiochus the third estate, a raiser of taxes. In history this was Seleucus the fourth. And in the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. And in his estate, Seleucus the fourth, shall stand up a vile person. This is Antiochus the fourth, Epiphanes, who was a Seleucid king from 175 BC to 164 BC, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Seleucid the fourth's son, Demetrius, was the rightful heir. but he was only 10 years old. And so his uncle, Antiochus IV, was able to seize the throne by intrigue. This is Antiochus Epiphanes that plundered Jerusalem and set up the abomination of desolation, sacrificed the pig on the altar, that very same one. And with the arms of the flood shall they be overtaken from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the priests of the covenant. In 173 BC, Antiochus IV invaded Egypt with a large force, flood, and took the 11-year-old Ptolemy the sixth prisoner. And this fits with that history in Daniel 11. Daniel 11 that we don't have time to cover. Let's see what else I have here I can talk about. It's funny, when that king got to Egypt and tried to set up himself as king instead of the 11-year-old Ptolemy, Josephus records that a Roman came to him and drew a circle about him and said, "You ain't stepping out of the circle until you rescind your kingship." Very interesting. But this king was so angry. Here it is. The Roman ambassador Popillus Linnaeus came to Egypt in July of 168 on Greek ships from Kittim, just like Daniel 11:30 said, and demanded that he, Antiochus, give up the title of king. Antiochus wanted to delay that, but the ambassador drew a circle around him on the ground and demanded he answer it before he stepped out of it. Antiochus grudgingly complied. But this made him so angry. On his way back to Damascus, he stopped in Jerusalem and took his anger and frustration out on them. There had been a revolt by the Judeans, started by rumors that Antiochus had died in Egypt. And he commissioned an officer, Apollonius, to ravage the Jews. He entered into Jerusalem peaceably, but then turned on the city and plundered it, murdering and burning as he went. Many men were killed, and many women and children taken captive, sold into slavery, many houses destroyed. The city of David, a portion of Jerusalem, was fortified by the Seleucid army and made into a fortress to dominate the city, and basically made it into a Greek colony. The king then moved against the Jews' religion. He abolished by decree the observance of Sabbaths, holy days, circumcision. Bibles were confiscated, and then the abomination of desolation was set up on the altar in the temple. So that's Daniel 11. Let's see here. Another quote from Josephus. No, this is from Encyclopedia Britannica, 2003. Antiochus's Hellenizing policies. He tried to Greekify them, brought him into conflict with the prosperous Oriental temple organizations. These are both the Jews and the pagans, and particularly with the Jews. Since Antiochus III's reign, the Jews had enjoyed extensive autonomy under their high priest. They were divided into two parties, the Orthodox Hasidians, the pious ones, and a Reform party that favored Hellenism. For financial reasons, Antiochus supported the Reform party, and in return for a considerable sum, permitted the high priest Jason to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem and to introduce the Greek mode of educating young people. In 172, for an even bigger tribute, he appointed Menelaus in place of Jason. But in 169, while Antiochus was campaigning in Egypt, Jason conquered Jerusalem, with the exception of the citadel, and murdered many of the adherents of his rival Menelaus. When Antiochus returned from Egypt in 167, he took Jerusalem by storm, enforced its Hellenism, and the city forfeited its privileges and was permanently garrisoned by Syrian soldiers. So that's also Daniel 11. Daniel's last vision is fulfilled at the time of the resurrection of the just. Daniel 12, verse 1. At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince, which stands for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So that's the resurrection of the just and of the unjust. And chapter 12, verse 8, I heard, but I understood not. And then I said, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said to me, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed to the time of the end. Well, if they're sealed, who's going to know it? Until they happen, you say, this fits. Okay? We all see through the same glass darkly, right? Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. That's the 1,290-day period. Blessed is he that is written and comes to the 1,305 and 30 days. See, these are some of the time periods that are in the book of Revelation, but they're sealed. I don't know if we can fit them until they happen. But go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of the days. So we're about to finish up the Old Testament, but I have something from Zephaniah, Zechariah, and Malachi to leave us with. So let's do that before we finish for the night. Zephaniah 3:13. I know we've got a little end, so I hope this makes it worth it. The remnant of Israel shall not do iniquity nor speak lies, neither shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth, for they shall feed and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. Well, when's that going to be? It ain't happened yet. Sing, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel, be glad and rejoice with all the heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord hath taken away thy judgments, and hath cast out thine enemy, the King of Israel, even the Lord, in the midst of thee. Thou shalt not see evil any more. Well, that king is going to be Jesus, millennial kingdom. In that day shall it be said to Jerusalem, Fear thou not, and to Zion, let not thy hands be slack. The Lord thy God in the midst of thee is mighty, he will save, he will rejoice over thee with joy, he will rest in his love, he will joy over thee with singing. I will gather them that are sorrowful from the solemn assembly, who are of thee, to whom the reproach of it was a burden. Behold, at that time I will undo all that afflict thee, and I will save her that halteth, and gather her that was driven out. And I will let them praise and fame in every land where they have been put to shame. And at that time will I bring you again, even in the time that I gather you. For I will make you a name and a praise among all the people of the earth, when I turn back your captivity before your eyes, saith the Lord. That's in the book of Revelation. Zechariah contains a fascinating prediction of a future earthquake. Zechariah 14, verse 1. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, even the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem, to the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, towards the east and towards the west, and there shall be a very great valley. Half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it towards the south. And you shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azeel. Yea, you shall flee, like you fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all nations with thee. And it shall come to pass in that day that the light shall not be clear nor dark, but it shall be one day which shall be known to the Lord, not day nor night. But it shall come to pass that at evening time it shall be light. And it shall be in that day that living waters shall go out from Jerusalem. That's Revelation 21, where the light is going to be God and his Son. Wow. Half of them towards the former sea, and half of them towards the hinder sea. In summer and in winter shall it be. And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day there shall be one Lord, and his name one. Wow. There actually is a earthquake fault line right there today that was also responsible for Uzziah's earthquake and the earthquake when Jesus died that tore the veil of the temple. I'm including a PDF on an internet post where it's called the Christ Quake. There's a map included of that fault line that goes near the present day Temple Mount. But if Dr. Ernest Martin is right, and the actual site of the temple was south of the Dome of the Rock Mosque, that makes the Wailing Wall not part of the temple, but actually the Roman fortress of Antonia, like I mentioned before, then the fault line would have run right underneath Ernest Martin's temple location. Wow. Maybe the Gihon Spring that provided the temple with water will be the source of the great river predicted in Zechariah. Wow. Finally, the book of Malachi ends with a bang. Or Malachi chapter 4, verse 1. For behold, the day comes that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, and yea, and all that do wickedly, shall be stubble. And the day that cometh shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch. That's the resurrection of the unjust. But you that reverence my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and you shall go forth and grow up his calves in the stall. Be cared for. And you shall tread upon the wicked, for they shall be ashes under the soles of your feet in the day that I shall do this, saith the Lord of hosts. Remember you the law of Moses my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and judgments? Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Well, who was Elijah the prophet that he's talking about? That's what John the Baptist was like, and this verse was quoted regarding John the Baptist, verse 6. So now we're ready for what Jesus prophesied in the Gospels. But with all this background, we have a much better idea of what he meant. For we're not anachronistically applying modern theological ideas back upon ancient prophecy. We've clearly seen the Old Testament prophecies were composite in nature, predicting events would happen in several different periods. Number one, to Judah and Israel during the law administration when the kingdom of Judah still existed. Number two, after that when the believers were in captivity through the time of the Messiah. Number three, during the ministry of Jesus, the Messiah, and the gospel period. And number four, in the millennial kingdom, which is still future. That is when all that the prophecies that I have found regarding the hope in the Old Testament occurred and were fulfilled in those four different periods. Not the church, because it was a mystery. As most prophecies go, they were spoken in enigmatic terms, but we were able to fit many elements with historical events or future prophecies' expectations. Some prophecies had more than one fulfillment, but the great mystery was still a secret. This was the eschatology of Judaism at the time that the gospel periods commenced. Consequently, when John and Jesus proclaimed that the kingdom of heaven was at hand, it made the believers tingle with excitement. They knew what we now know from the Old Testament. And now we're tingling too. See you next week for the next session. Bless you.